Right, guys, TacticalRab back again today. Hope you're all doing well and enjoying your day so far. Welcome to episode 44 of the Breaking Point podcast. It is a very special one. I've got Austin, I've got EasyMac back alongside me. We also have a very special guest, Mr. Jake Rowell, formerly creative director and art lead from Activision, Blizzard, and the studios involved with Call of Duty from 2010 to 2015. Many other fantastic projects we're going to discuss today. But so much history in the Call of Duty franchise, behind the scenes stuff that no one ever really hears about. We're going to be diving into some of it with Jake today, some relations to competitive play, the future of it, but also just some great stuff about Call of Duty history, I'm sure, that you guys as Call of Duty fans, I'm sure are going to enjoy. We're live on Twitch right now. Thanks to all those tuning in. Also those after the fact, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, whatever it's called, Apple podcast type stuff. It's fantastic. Jake, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure. We've had a great brief discussion off air as well about all the stuff that you never hear about as a Call of Duty fan behind the scenes. But yeah, how are you doing, first of all?
Oh, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. Good. It's good. Super excited to just sit down and talk a little bit of Call of Duty and kind of reminisce back in the day when we were working on it and share some stories.
Absolutely. Gents, Lion, Austin, how are we doing? I know Austin, bit of an issue with the odd laptop situation, but we're in business now.
Yeah, you know, I've had a rough week with it, but we're going good. We finally got it up and running. So, how about you, Lion?
Oh, just designing. Back at work. I've actually got work in 2 hours, which is not ideal, but it's all good. Back for another podcast.
Love to see it. Fantastic stuff. So yeah, Jake, most of our audience is from the Call of Duty side, but I'm sure people are familiar to some degree with your work outside of the franchise. I saw on Final Fantasy IX, Shark Tale, Superman Returns, in kind of the film side of the entertainment business. It'd be great if you could touch a little bit on how you found yourself being part of the Call of Duty franchise in the first place.
Yeah, I started in games in '96. I was actually pretty young. I was 19, and I got a job working for Microsoft. And at the time, computer graphics was pretty new. Jurassic Park had just come out, Toy Story. I was a fine art major in school. I started dabbling in computer graphics and got a job, and I was traveling all around the country doing golf courses and filming them and recreating them. And that led to Final Fantasy IX. I took a job out in Hawaii, of all places, which is pretty cool, and learned to surf and met my wife out there and all kinds of friends. And we made Final Fantasy IX. We made Final Fantasy the movie. And then we also did the Animatrix, which was pretty cool. If you guys know the Animatrix piece that came out during the Matrix time. And then I did like a 10-year run in film. And I worked on, like you said, Superman. I worked at Dreamworks. I kind of lived in LA doing the film circuit, which is what artists do. And I was coming up through the art ranks. So like artist, senior artist, art lead, art director, et cetera, et cetera. And while all this was happening, I was watching games, and I'm a big gamer. I love to play games, and I was working on film but playing games at night. And I was watching what was happening, and my favorite game at the time, I love Modern Warfare. Like we're talking like, what was this, 2007? I think 2008. And then I wanted to get back into games and real-time graphics, and that led me over to Infinity Ward, joining the team. And it was an interesting time, which we can talk a little bit more about later. But, we were coming off of Mod 2, and we were going to make Mod 3, and we were off and running, and it was great. And I joined the studio at the right time with amazing people there, and spent, I think, almost 5 years there making Modern Warfare 3, Ghosts, and then the studio was also kind of helping with, all the studios help each other. During Black Ops 1, Black Ops 2, we worked with the company Sledgehammer, which is known now, but at the time they were just starting, Ravensoft, Neversoft. So it was a great time. And then the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working in virtual reality and making VR products and working with a guy named Jon Favreau, which is a guy that created The Mandalorian, the Iron Man director, and he and I have been making some VR together, and it's been really fun.
Fantastic.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Lots of stuff and I, again, just to say, I'm an artist by trade. I'm a visual storyteller. I've learned through just making a lot of product, how that touches gameplay. And when you're in games and interactive space, I always say interactive software, the visuals are in service of the gameplay experience. And in film, it's in service of the story, right? And so you always have to kind of make that line between the two. And it's been an interesting journey for me as an artist, because you always want the fidelity in the art to be so good, but you always have to balance that with what's fun to play. So being a gamer and playing games is really important, I think.
Yeah, that's a great observation, I think, because especially from our kind of side of things, being very heavily involved in the competitive Call of Duty side, there's always talk about, well, does this need to be in the game? Does that make the game well balanced? And these type of questions are like features that are in the game that, look nice and whatever, but do they serve the game in the best way? That's a very subjective thing. So that's kind of the first kind of question I had was regarding, I guess, when you come up and make the graphics, it feels like, there's a campaign. The campaign used to be several years ago. That was the Call of Duty game that came out. Like that was all the marketing was around the campaign, and then the multiplayer and zombies or whatever was kind of just like thrown on the side. Nowadays, it's very much a different way around, where the kind of the multiplayer and like the Warzone is kind of the fundamental thing that's pushed. But I guess campaign was kind of the fundamental thing that was worked on, and then some of those features then came across into multiplayer. Like some of the maps feel like they're kind of taken from where the characters go in the campaign, and a lot of, I'm sure, the characters, like the character models, and like Riley, as I'm sure maybe you could tell that story here for the stream in a couple of seconds about like that coming, of course, from campaign into multiplayer. And just some of the stories behind the characters, and like I thought I mentioned just the artwork on the wall behind you as well, just to throw that in, so maybe you can tie some of this stuff together.
Yeah. I think at the time, and it might be different now because I haven't been in the studios recently making COD, but at the time, 2008, 9, 10 through 15, multiplayer even inside the studio was so important. And we were sitting down while the campaign's being written and talked about from the single player side, the cross-connective tissue between the two design groups were constantly talking. And so as art kind of wraps around that and in service of that, we were always thinking about our squads from a multiplayer space. Like, what are the various squads we want to see put against each other, right, at the time? And if you think about Mod 3, you had the SAS, right? But then you also had like the Kimwar guys, which were completely different types of squads. And we were thinking about those guys and how they would look and feel for multiplayer because the reads were so important. But at the same time, as artists, we were also saying, well, we need to use those characters in the campaign and in service of. So I find that the stories that's coming from campaign influenced the locations and the character squads that were in multiplayer. But we had to design them to favor multiplayer first and foremost for the experience of the actual competitive side. And that ultimately came back and made, I think, single player stronger. So when you work through there and you were fighting through London, for example, and you had to fight the Kimwar guys, those reads that were coming off in multiplayer were coming across in single player, even though the actual orchestration of it was different and they were telling a story. So I think the same thing with weapons. The weapon classes were discussed heavily in multiplayer. We understood what they were doing for multiplayer to service multiplayer, and then single player absorbed those ideas. And then they had a plethora of content to say, oh, what do we want our hero character to come in with? What do you, meaning you personally, what is the squad that's with you? What are they carrying? And then all of the research that we were getting from our military advisors were also basically playing into this. And so there was essentially a group of people all revolving around this thing, and they were never separate at the time. They were completely combined. And if we made a great character squad for single player, let's say that told the story really well, and they didn't play well in multiplayer, they're cut. We didn't use them in multiplayer. And that's where balancing the budget and the schedules, you can't miss. You might get one miss on that. You miss two, now we're down one squad in multiplayer, and then all of a sudden we have to make up that body of work and we're off and running again, or do we have to go back and augment it and change it? So that's the kind of the squads, and I could talk about this for hours, by the way, the core thinking. But to kind of transition over to Riley, which is a really cool segue, that character in Ghosts, which was senior artist Tom Sacklesay was the one that actually created the actual dog. I was his art lead, and that was my dog growing up. So I when they wanted to put a dog in the game, I asked single player and multiplayer, what do you guys care what he looks like? And they're like, no, you're the art lead. What do you want to do? And I'm like, I grew up with a Heidelberg German Shepherd, and he was awesome. His name was Taylor. And I was like, man, I want to make the dog my dog growing up. But I didn't tell anybody that was my dog growing up, because if I did, they probably wouldn't want to make it. Instead, we cast dogs. We actually had different dogs, and everybody settled on the one that I liked, which was the Heidelberg German Shepherd. We filmed them, we scanned them, we did all kinds of stuff. We worked on the gear, and that was more from the service of the story. But we wanted them in the gameplay for multiplayer as a kill streak. And we were talking about that earlier, which I want to hear your version of that story, because I didn't do that, and that's great. But that's how the character evolved, and for me, I'm just awesome. I just love that my dog growing up was basically, put into a COD game and lives on forever, as a hero.
Yeah, your dog
really,
terrorized. Really cool. Sorry, your dog terrorized thousands and thousands of people.
Yes.
Whoa.
I think it's
ruined their
really
day.
cool to think about that. Like I always knew like the maps from like multiplayer, you would see them in the campaign, but I never really registered that like the squads that you were fighting with and against in campaign were also in the multiplayer side. Like I just never realized that up until now. Like nowadays they have like things called operators that you can like pick your skin that you play in multiplayer and you see them. But even thinking like going back into MW3 and Ghosts and thinking about that, I that never clicked in my head, and I have, hundreds and hundreds of hours in both of those. So that's really cool to hear. But yeah, I always remembered because like I don't know why, but pets in the campaigns and story modes for some reason stick in my head like really clearly whenever I play these. So I always knew Riley from my favorite campaign mission is the one where you're sneaking. There's always like one slow sneaky mission in every campaign, and that was the one where yeah, that was the one where you would take control of the dog. The dog would like go through the tall grass, jump at people, and then you would slowly move up, and then you would go back with the dog because it had like a camera on its back. So I always loved like all the details, and then seeing it in like the multiplayer. So that was always something I enjoyed.
That's what's fun too, is like when you sit down and there's a single player element, like a story like that in gameplay, but the design and creation of the dog, and then getting our military advisors and giving us reference of what they were using, and then us saying, well, it's a little bit in the future. Let's kind of look at where technology is going. And I remember when Tom did a concept piece of the gear, and he put a camera on his back. And that is what ultimately influenced that story beat in single player. It wasn't originally there. It was done more with like call signs and stuff like that. But with the camera, it added another gameplay element, and it just kind of evolved between, art and single player design, and then what was fun to do in the game. So it's a cool story.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's an awesome one.
I mean, yeah, the thing you were mentioning, just in case the chat wasn't here right as things started, like my favorite thing to do with Riley the dog, or at least the thing that would frustrate me the most, I only started doing it when other people, or at least, you don't intentionally die and spawn somewhere else, but it used to be the most frustrating thing to die to when someone would call in the guard dog, and then they might die and spawn across the other side of the map on these massive maps that there were in Ghosts, like, Siege,
Really big.
Chasm, even a map like Octane, for example, and you'd spawn on the other side at the other flag, and then Riley would just come charging across through the middle to get back to you and just take down everyone in the wake. And yeah, that guard dog could put up a fight for sure. So it's interesting to know that like those kind of things where designed a lot with multiplayer in mind and then kind of fused into the campaign. That's because that's the thing. It's very memorable, really, as you say, Austin. Thinking back to like the games I tended to play the most of the Black Ops games, but just thinking it was Black Ops and Spetsnaz, and you had the different operators from the different teams, and that's just and it fitted nicely with the campaign, and everything seemed intertwined. It doesn't necessarily quite have that feel anymore, but
I guess one quick question I had was a lot of people tend to link like Treyarch with like more like bright cartoony colors. Whereas IW and I guess like Sledgehammer has been kind of on like the dollar like grayscale colors. When you were designing like some of the campaign elements and characters, like does that influence like the direction you go with the colors, like depending on who you're working for? Because I guess Ghost and MW3 were both IW, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because with Activision, they give each studio quite a bit of autonomy, at least again back then. And now I think it's becoming more of a global effort across the studios and alignment across franchise. But at the time, Treyarch had a lot of autonomy on how they wanted to go with their campaign and their feel, multiplayer. Same thing with IW. And IW being the start of it, we were so based, even when I joined. And you got to remember, when I joined, they had already made Call of Duty 2, and Mod 1, and I was coming in at the Mod 2, Mod 3 transition, right? And so we were so heavily influenced by our military advisors and our core military foundational blocks that it just naturally influences that color palette. And if you look at the military, it is kind of desaturated. It is a little bit more drab. It's a little bit less colorful. The entire military structure, you just go into any military base anywhere, and it's like that for a reason. It's a lot of midtones. I always say midtones, right? Speaking of art, you have the brights and you have the darks, and you have midtones. Well, midtones kind of blend out, right? And I think because our stories were that way, and because our missions carried over both single player and multiplayer to be rooted that way, our visual design flowed that way. But we were always looking for ways to add some accents, some special little thing that's going to be a great read, that's going to make the game. You're dealing with camo. You're supposed to lose people with camouflage, right? But what still balances that fun gameplay, where I think Treyarch and their technique with multiplayer, and I wasn't there, so I can't speak for them, but it seemed like their core was, well, let's do something a little different than that. And I think that's where that kind of evolved. I think it's where zombies kind of evolved from. And if you come all the way back to Ghosts with us, we had like an alien, invasion side story versus zombies. And that's where we started playing more with color. We started letting you add accents to your multiplayer characters that stood out and is a little bit more custom. And I think that was the early days of what we see with Fortnite today, with everything being your user, avatar and accents across the board. And I think you see that with COD as well, with Warzone. So those were the early days of it, but we were still holding on to our roots, our foundational pieces. And some of the other studios were a little bit more free to try that. And I think as it was successful, it came back to IW and we started doing it too. But it was on purpose.
I feel like the Black Ops series was like Black Ops 2, 3, and 4 were so vibrant because they were set in the future as well. Whereas like the Modern Warfare series and Ghosts were all current events, and same with like Black Ops 1 set in the 60s, had that darker, more grayscale. But which was your favorite game to work on? Was it Modern Warfare 3 or was it COD Ghosts? And for what reason?
Oh, that's a tough question for me because I really enjoyed working on both of them. I can tell you this to start the conversation. My favorite game of the Call of Duty franchise is Mod 1. Like, I love Modern Warfare 1. I just think it's so good. It's why I wanted to work in the franchise. It's why I wanted to leave film and go work on games. So having a chance to work on Modern Warfare 3, I have to give it to Mod 3 because you have to understand, too, at the time of the studio and Activision, not to get into some of the challenges we were facing, but we had just lost our 2 studio heads. Jason and Vince, half the studio left and created Respawn. And we were left there, half of us, and we had to hire another half, rebuild the studio, start working with Sledgehammer to make Modern Warfare 3. We had 2 new studio heads come over from Activision, which was Steve Pierce and Steve Ackridge, which were wonderful. I'm friends with both of them still to this day. And that challenge to have a studio so established, coming off of mega hits, have that breakdown for, I think in the long run, when you look at it now, it was probably one of the best things for the industry. Respawn came from it, all the games that came from them, the rebuild of IW, where we are today with that, Sledgehammer coming up, Ravensoft coming up, Neversoft transitioning over into COD, the merger with IW. All of this was before that. right? And you talk about Black Ops 1, Black Ops 2, Advanced Warfare, World at War, you name all this stuff, Modern Warfare Reboot, right? Warzone. All of this is before that. And if I feel like if we didn't rebuild that studio and make a hit with Modern Warfare 3, the franchise could have been really hit hard. And our brand and IW as a brand would have been hit. And where would we be today? Someplace else. But I think that success of that and the challenge that was associated with, I'm so proud of everybody that hung in there and what we did. So I have to give it to that. I know it's a heavy answer to your question, but it was a heavy time. Like we didn't know if we were going to survive. We didn't know if we were going to make a hit. We didn't know if people would like it. We didn't know if you lost all the best developers going over to Respawn, and we did lose a lot of amazing talent. There's no doubt about it, but I think we also gained a lot of really amazing talent, and we just kept moving forward. So I have to give it to Mod 3.
I forgot that was the year that because now that you're saying that all, it actually clicks that was the year like a lot of the features for like the multiplayer side came in like a couple months late, like not late, but they were like more DLC. And I completely forgot that a bunch of the main studio heads dipped out that year because it just seems like so long ago. But I guess I have two questions for you based off that. Having been a fan of the Modern Warfare 1, obviously you got to design or like redesign the Captain Price and Soap and a lot of like those like legendary characters and put your own twist if you worked on any of those guys. But was it fun doing that, like trying to tweaking a classic, or was it fun in Ghost because that was a first of its kind, so you were really just building out the characters right off the rip? You kind of didn't have anything to base that on. So which one did you kind of prefer on that front?
Again, I'm going to give you a compound answer. You have to kind of look at a little of the lineage at that point. I joined on to do Superman Returns because I wanted to be a part of recreating what would essentially be an icon, right? A world icon, Superman. You get a chance to add your 2 cents or contribute a verse there, right? After Superman, I joined a small animated film called Astro Boy. Now, if Superman's one of the biggest Western icons, Astro Boy is one of the biggest Eastern icons. I mean, you go through, Japan and China and you have Astro Boy at the malls, and so I wanted to add my take to that. And as the art director, I said, I only have one request. I want to be a part of redesigning that character for 3D, go from 2D to 3D. And so that's always been a little bit of a mantra for me in my career. So coming over to COD, that was part of what I wanted to do is contribute my verse to Task Force 141. I was a huge fan of what they did for Mod 1 and Mod 2. Joel at the time, which was their art lead, he went over to Respawn, and I just loved the work that he did. And I didn't know him at the time, but to come in and have the opportunity to contribute that, make a version of Price for Africa, and then make a version for Price that goes to Prague. Do the same thing for Soap. Do a version of Nikolai, Nikolai's a great character. And so he's this big guy and he's a pilot, and being able to make that, also make a new character in Keegan, which was a sniper, and then add Yuri to the mix. Yuri was a new character. And so we got to build him up from the ground up, and he was kind of from that PMC squad concept. Add some to, Makarov at the time, which was the iconic villain, right? So you get a chance to contribute in that space, and it's so fun. And I think it reached that point of excitement. And I think I clicked that box. But then going over to Ghost, this is a compound part. Ghost was inspired from the character Ghost for Mod 2, which died, right? In Mod 2, or so we think. And being able to create all the skull masks, which now you see everywhere. These skull masks are every place. You can't go to a paintball course without seeing the skull masks that I designed, which is pretty cool, or you see them in the game. Like I was just talking to a neighbor, and he's playing Call of Duty Mobile, and he's like, "Hey, did you do any of these characters?" And he pulled up one, and he had the skull mask from Ghosts on it. And I'm like, "Well, I didn't do the character, but I did the skull mask." So I think both of them present their own challenge and inspiration. But the core reason I joined is I wanted to get back into games. I wanted to get back into real time. I loved COD, and I wanted to do my version of the characters and contribute a verse there and build off of what people did before me. So I loved it. I'm still very, very proud of the work and proud of the team and everybody's efforts there. It was pretty fun. It leads to a really good question back there to that piece of artwork back there in the pack, but I don't know when we want to talk about that. Good question, though.
I'll take it. I always thought the ghosts like characters and the backstory and that whole campaign, like I loved like that whole setup. I was so disappointed they like that in Advanced Warfare. We've never seen a sequel to it.
Yeah.
So I always thought like it would be so nice if there was like a Modern Warfare spin-off where they like, or like a DLC, like something where it would like kind of branch into like Logan and his family on that side. Cause I always thought that was like one of the coolest storylines that we've had in Call of Duty that was never really expanded on.
A cool story on the character creation of Ghosts, the game Ghosts. That was a cool collaboration because up until that point, IW had really primarily worked on the main characters inside their own house, right? Like it didn't leave the walls of IW. We had an opportunity to work with a company, Neversoft, which has now been merged with IW. But at the time, you know, they had their own really talented team. And what I tried to do is say, okay, let's just grow our internal team. Assume that every single person, they had their own lead over there, Chris, George. But assume that every single one of those people are just an additive to the team. Everybody should get like a hero character. Everybody should try to have a hero character, a hero squad, or something to kind of add their piece to. And in the end, it was wonderful because we actually were able to do twice as many squads as we were able to do before, plus the alien mode, which Neversoft really owned that. And then at the same time, like you were saying, Logan, you know, there was different costumes. So we had an underwater costume. So they were in their SEAL kind of, you know, wetsuits.
Yeah.
Raven worked on that.
Mission.
Yeah, Raven worked on that squad, even though the faces, and we held the faces at IW with a guy named Steven Giesler, and I did all the faces. So that's another thing to probably say. And Steven's an artist that goes all the way back to Final Fantasy days with me. He and I have worked together back and forth since 98. And so we would do the faces, but the squad bodies were done, and they did the underwater ones at Raven. But then Neversoft took another squad version of the Ghost characters, and then we did one internally. A guy named Nia Lamb did what you'd see as the typical PMC clothing. And what was cool about that is that, and then I did all the skulls, right, and the faces. So in the end, when you brought all that work together, even though it was done with 3 different teams, it all felt like the same squad, and it had the same language, and it felt really quite holistic. And I always wanted to see those characters evolve too. I wanted to see what were you going to do with them after that campaign. They've never done anything with it, but I thought it would be fun to see it. Another inside story.
I mean, exactly. Speaking of that, I would love you to share that the artwork over your left shoulder, kind of like a culmination of all the characters that you worked with in the Call of Duty side, the artist who created it for you, and like who had created some of the early characters as well. I think people would love to hear how, like, you know, you don't have any of your art particularly on the wall, but you'll still very much appreciate what you achieved throughout that Call of Duty period.
I love other artists and other artists' work. So as you work with other artists, you collect work. You give work away, and then you collect work. And while working on Mod 3, we met a amazing, probably to me, just if you look him up, he's an artist out of Korea, Kim Jung-ji. And he does these amazing illustrations, and he does these perspective illustrations. He just sits down and he draws them. I've rarely seen anybody sit down and draw right off the cuff like that, no matter what the subject matter is. And he's so nice and so wonderful. And I got to, you know, get to know him and become friends with him a little bit. And then his agent also was actually working on Call of Duty as a concept artist as well. So there was a connection there. And then through that process, he did this piece for me, which is the death of Soap, which happens in Prague, right? So he took the characters that I designed, which was Price and Soap and Nikolai and Keegan, and then the task force that they were fighting, right? And he put them in Prague, and he did this piece, and he just literally just played the game and had it in his head, and he did this original piece, and so that's a memento of that time, and it's an original piece. I love it, and it was inspired by the work that we did, and yeah, good one.
That is awesome. So another question I had on we were talking about the kind of autonomy that, to a degree, that Treyarch and Infinity Ward had at the time. I think, as Austin mentioned earlier, to do with the color palette of the games, there also, I think, seems to fans, at least from the competitive side, that there was a difference in terms of map design philosophy between the studios. Now, I don't know how much, of course, as art lead, a creative director, you're involved, particularly with how the maps are designed and laid out, but I think a lot of people would say that generally the Treyarch games preferred the more kind of 3-lane, people would say more boring, I suppose, map design, which I think for competitive play is preferable. And then for Infinity Ward, there were a few, I mean, don't get me wrong, Ghost for Search and Destroy is probably my favorite Search and Destroy game ever. There's a few maps in there, Freight, Sovereign, Octane, Warhawk especially is my favorite, that were beautiful for competitive Search and Destroy. But for the other game modes, it's a little bit questionable. So I wonder how, was there any personal preference from your side on what kind of map you preferred, or did you prefer more of like a variety between the different designs? Because, you want it to allow for different play styles. I'm sure that's what people always talked about, right? Like, this map's a sniper map, this map's good for shotguns, this type of stuff.
Well, I'll start with saying that multiplayer design is, they own that space, right? Each studio that's heading that game, they have their philosophies. They have their, what would essentially be multiplayer design Bible. And what did they want to accomplish in that game? And then how does that evolve from game to game? I think back in the day, there was a Bible within IW, and that evolutionary learning of multiplayer maps leading from one game to the next. I think Treyarch had their own as well. From a fan perspective now, since I've left working on it, I see that those Bibles have almost merged across the franchises. And the learning from game to game is starting to become more holistic, right? Versus the Treyarch style, versus the IW style, versus the Sledgehammer style, which was very clear before. I think it's starting to kind of become more holistic in the learnings and trying to give fans, the best of all of those spaces that you were saying. For me personally now, just speaking personally, I kind of like fast-paced maps. I'm kind of like an SMG kind of fella. I want to be running fast, moving quick. And if I'm not doing that, I kind of like sniper maps, as a secondary. So that's me playing as a fan. Making them, I always keep going back to that kind of general mantra of whether it be characters, whether it be weapons, whether it be the environments, my job is to be in service of the gameplay. And if you're in service of the gameplay, then you're in service of the game designers and their philosophies. Do we have input? We have input like everybody in the studio playing the game, which is a cool little side story we used to do at IW, is we'd shut the whole studio down at 5 o'clock, 5:30, and everybody would jump on and play multiplayer. And we would have jam sessions afterwards and talk about what we liked and what we didn't like about it. So everybody had a voice, but it was their space to own, just like art's our space to own. And if you're in service of that gameplay, you offer your point of view, but rarely should your point of view be, oh, this is going to look prettier, right? This is going to look better. It's going to have better lighting. Lots of times my notes when I'd go in those sessions would be, do you guys know you have a dark spot over here that people could just stop, hide, disappear, never be seen, and just take people off and you're never going to catch them? And that's just looking at it from an artistic perspective. Or do you guys have a blind spot here? Is that what you want? Oh, that is what you want. Okay, cool. So those are the type of things that for me, but I'm speaking on two parts, as a developer and as a fan. And I want fast-paced maps, SMG, move quick, or give me a nice map where I can sniper.
And we could have used you the last couple of years. I know we had one skin that was called Rosa that had it was all black, so any dark spot on any map, it would blend in and you wouldn't be able to be seen. And it was like a big issue for a couple months until they finally dialed down the light tone that was like bouncing off of her suit. So, but one question I had was, have you guys ever created like an area within the campaign that was like so like either good looking or it just had a great breakdown of it that they ended up trying to make that into like a multiplayer map or try to like steal some of the areas of it like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember one in particular. Now, I'm not sure if it truly. That's what's weird about this. 10 years have passed, right? So we're kind of celebrating the 10-year anniversary of Mod 3, and next year or 2 years from now will be Ghost, right? So sometimes the stories get kind of restacked in your mind, but at the time, I remember the environment team was working on this really cool in Ghost, this really cool kind of tree, forest, jungle like map, and it was for the single player campaign. And if you remember, you were moving through those trees and you're kind of surrounded by this huge forest. And at the time, that wasn't a multiplayer map. And I think it got turned into a multiplayer map. And that was a great example because it was just such a beautiful location and it was really fun to play it in single player that I think it got broken down and turned into a multiplayer space. And the environment team did a wonderful job on that because we used that location for our initial Greenlight presentation and also kind of like an early drop to the fans back in the day of the characters running through that. Tim McGrath and he was the environment lead. They just all did a great job, and I think that inspired a multiplayer map from it. That's a good example, but it happens. I mean, it happens back and forth, like I was saying earlier, just the holistic nature of the back and forth of the teams. I do know Mod 3, for example, there's a great multiplayer map that happens in London, and that's with the Kimwar guys. And that was one of the first character squads that I made. And I came in at a time where I don't know if did the environment inspire the multiplayer map, or was it the other way around? Was it always planned?
That's really cool. That's awesome to hear because there's just so many like different environments that I'll play like the single player, and it's like, wow, this could make a great map, and hear that's actually been done before. That's actually really cool.
Did you? Oh, sorry. Now go for it. Go for it.
No, you go.
Oh, it's completely different. So you should go to keep it connected.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as you guys are hearing me talk, like, there's so many people that work on these, and Mod 3 was like inside IW was probably 80 developers to 100 developers. Now we're talking hundreds, right? Multiple studios working together. But when you're that tight knit across all the various departments, you have weapons and character art, you have environment art, you have effects, you have animation, rigging, single player design, multiplayer design, audio, production, everything, right? You have this entire system at work. The most important thing to think about is each little team is probably anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 people large, and they talk to one another constantly. And, you can imagine some of the, my analogy is you always go into this rock tumbler and you're all jagged, and by the time you tumble and tumble and tumble, you come out, you're pretty smooth, right? And that's a refined game. But imagine some of the talks behind closed doors and the sessions that have to go on to make a great game. A lot of arguments or debates or, the best ones come from that push-pull. And that's why I'm calling out certain people's names along the way, because without those people, their push and pull in specific areas, we wouldn't have had Riley's camera as an example, right? Somebody had an idea and they just did it and it inspired and off and running. So that was my closing piece on that one. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to know did you ever play or see Infinite Warfare? So like the first one after you left?
I did. Now, interesting story there. I was still at the studio. Now, the studio was merging with Neversoft at that time. And Steve Pierce had gone back to corporate, my studio head. Steve Ackridge was leaving the studio, and I think he was retiring. And it was a very interesting time. But there was a small group of us that formed across all the different departments, and we started laying the early foundational bricks for Infinite Warfare, or what at the time we were calling Space COD, right? And because it was going to all happen up in space, and I think that at the time, even before I left, there was a campaign against Mars and the colony on Mars, and then Earth, and all of those things were just starting to form. And I remember thinking to myself that the game had a lot of potential, for me. I was such a rooted in the traditional. I wanted to do the traditional that I didn't have as much interest in the space version of it. And it seemed like a good time if I was going to move on and start doing something else in VR. And I remember talking to the studio heads and everything, and it was just the right time to call it and say, okay, I'm going to move on and I'm going to do some other stuff. And the studio then, just like everything, keeps progressing. Afterwards, the game came out. I played it. Almost all of my colleagues and friends worked on it, and so I was really excited about what they did. Me personally, I love when they rebooted at IW and went back to the Modern Warfare franchise, because I think that's its DNA. Like I was saying about the foundation of the studio, it's the DNA of the studio, and so it's an interesting. But that's part of the evolution of making games.
Yeah. The reason I brought up Infinite Warfare was because, one, it was the first one after you were there, but also there was a character in the multiplayer which was known as the Skinny Bot, and it had like a smaller hitbox in the leg region than other characters. And I'm wondering if you ever saw that and like what your take was on that to go art ahead of the actual gameplay.
Wasn't there, so I couldn't talk to what was the discussions. Was that, they had to have known though. There's just enough gameplay sessions that you make a character like that and you have the hitbox the way it is and you're playing it every day, that they had to have decided they were going to leave it, right? Now, what was the internal discussions on that back and forth? I can imagine it was pretty heavy, that there was probably two sides. One was it's too cool of a character not to have in it visually, and the other side was it's very fun because it gives an advantage, right? And so the visuals won out on that one, it seems. Again, I wasn't there to comment on it, but I know this. It was certainly a debate.
Yeah. Understandable.
Good question. If I were there, it's interesting because, again, I'm such a visual person, but I've never tried to have debates as an art leader, an art director, or even a director now of VR stuff where you're putting in stuff that clearly hurts the gameplay to the fan base, right? Like that's something where as much as you love stuff, you let that go and you have to favor gameplay. It's really hard to do. It's easy to say and it's hard to do. I've certainly stumbled on that a few times through my career where I favored the visuals versus the gameplay, and I've learned my lesson. Now I'm older, and so I find myself not making that mistake as often, but it's a good question though.
Yeah, there's so much about that, right? Like, because there's so much to be said for, okay, what visually might be great but hurts the fan base, but it's like, which part of the fan base is being served? That's kind of, from our perspective, that's quite interesting because we see a lot of people that they might really like features. Maybe more casual players tend to like features that maybe look quite good and seem quite good on paper, but maybe from a competitive standpoint are quite broken. So then it's like, how do we, if you're catering to the general population, you're going to lean towards putting in features that a more casual player is going to like, which, is totally understandable. I think maybe in the COD scene, sometimes we get at least in the competitive COD scene, we get a bit too entitled in the sense that we think, okay, because generally we play the game more than more casual players tend to be better. Therefore, the developers should listen to us type thing. But that's kind of leads to a question I had on, we were discussing the autonomy of the studios, and a big discussion of the day is like, okay, Halo's releasing, it's got ranked play at launch, it's got esports team skins at launch, it's got all these features that in the competitive Call of Duty scene we've been asking for at launch in these Call of Duty games for years. Now, I forget exactly what it was like back in Ghost. I think there was like a clan v clan type thing going on. But it may be that the push towards it wasn't quite there then, but in the last couple of years, especially since the esports has franchised, like teams have to pay 25 million over a certain amount of years to get into the league, there's been a lot of pressure, I think, from at least a competitive scene to try and push the CD on Activision to say, look, ranked play, like, why is it not there at launch? Like, these are some features that should be in the game. I just wonder, from your perspective, like, maybe at the time it was very different, but was there, because, it's been theorized that maybe Activision say to the developers, look, let's hold off on ranked play, leave it until like February, and then that'll give us a nice little boost in player base when it gets to that time. Like, and how much were they involved in that kind of discussion back then? Because at least it's theorized nowadays that Activision have quite some say in how the developers design things to make sure it caters to what they want to achieve with Warzone and stuff like this, because I guess that's now a cross developer project, whereas back in the day it was kind of dev by dev, and Treyarch tended to focus more on the competitive side, Infinity Ward tended to focus more on the casual side. And now maybe things are changing. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling a bit, but hopefully that made sense.
It does. I really don't know, because I've been away from it for a long time now. I guess 5-6 years. I know this though, that there's a lot of really positive energy going into the development of these products. And when you think about a fan base as big as Call of Duty, I mean, that's a big fan base, and there's a lot of different groups that want different things from the product. I know that at the first foremost thing, since when I was there, I'm sure it's still the same thing. What do the fans want? And then how do we balance that to how do we achieve it? How do we achieve that across the fan base and what other people want? And I don't think there's ever a time where someone's going and seeing what would naturally be a common sense feature and saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to listen to the fans. That's not ever the discussion inside the studios. It's always really, how do you balance it with a very big request list of what people want, and then expectational list, and then the history of the franchise and what best serves that franchise. Sometimes when you're starting with a new product, you can have a lot more liberties towards that. And so, while I'm not there and I can't speak to the train of that, I know that there's nothing but good intentions from it. I've never been in any of the conversations when I was there where we were listening to the fan base and said, "No, we're not going to listen to them." It was actually just the opposite. It's like, we have to listen to them. We want to listen to them. How do we achieve it? How do we do that in the roadmap of the franchise? And there's a lot of people that are really smart that are trying to guide the franchise for its longevity as well. They don't want to see it burn out. They don't want to have that franchise get away. So they're trying to think how to evolve the project. And so I think sometimes it's probably a lot like government. Think about like government, not to get all political, but you have to think years out, and you have to kind of make a roadmap, and you're going to have some conviction towards that roadmap. And when you're thinking about any type of project planning and franchise planning, that's what happens. And then every single product that gets added, it slightly changes that list of stuff. And now how do you adjust and restack and move forward? So sometimes it seems like the developers are lagging, but I think it's really more them trying to adjust to it moving faster than they can create the product. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm sure things are changing very quickly as well in terms of how Activision and the publishers decide to kind of manage that, right? Like, especially with Warzone coming out, like it's
that changed everything.
It's been very changeable.
Yeah. Warzone and it coming out and its success has changed that trajectory. And I think it for the positive, right? Me personally speaking as a fan. Now, be pre-Warzone, having that trajectory of that franchise, not knowing if it was going to be successful to the fan base. You might have a slightly different path. And now all of a sudden the success point happens, and now you got to adjust. So.
Exactly. Very true. So to take a slightly different tag, a question I was kind of wondering, given your history in film and in the gaming side, is that when you go to a film, usually it's displayed on the big screen at 24 frames per second. That's kind of like the standard film FPS. There are some that's different, but generally, I don't know, a film higher than that frame rate seems kind of unnatural somehow. It's kind of weird. But in in gaming, obviously FPS is king, right? Like, how many frames can we get per second? In terms of designing the campaign and stuff, I guess if you're designing for consoles back in the day, that would be 60. But nowadays, these games are played on PCs that, can run these games at 300, 400 FPS. So, how did you kind of, how did you, was that a consideration when you, in design between the two of them, or is it not really something that matters too much?
Specifically in the cinematics, or
Yeah, from the
gameplay of
cinematics
the motor?
perspective, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
whatever you think.
both. Probably both. At the time, for Mod 3 and for Ghost, they were pre-rendered cinematics, right? So think about them like mission briefings. And in Mod 3, the mission briefings were schematics, and you had your overhead, and you kind of were told what you needed to do. In Ghost, we took a bit more of corporate wanted to do something different. And so we took a little bit more of like a comic book story approach, where we would tell it through kind of pictorial form and then have a schematic overlay, and it'd set up the mission. And therefore, I think it wasn't full on animation cinematics where you're seeing actors play out the roles and stuff. So those were pre-rendered. I think a lot of stuff on Black Ops, which were those pre-rendered cutscenes that were great. I see, and it's already happening, and it's already been happening, but I think it's going to become better and better and better, a seamless transition between that, right? So everything's going to be real time. So what you're playing in the game real time, running at whatever frames per second, console or PC, it's going to transition over into the story cinematic part of it. And it's literally going to be a seamless transition. We're seeing it now with games. It's going to get better and better and better. They're going to figure out their language on how to best transition those cutscenes. So the player just feels like it's a natural transition. Same thing with multiplayer too. Multiplayer, you're onboarding into the map, you're respawning back into the map. This transitional element, to me, that's where it gets really exciting. And then you start throwing in a little bit of the idea of competitive VR, which is a completely different landscape. Think about that and the frame rate requirements associated. You can't just cut. You have to feel that transitional element. So if you're playing a game in, let's say, VR, you want that to be a seamless transition into your story cut, get the information you need back into the gameplay. And a lot of times I think that there's not even going to be a stopping point. Sometimes it's just going to start happening like you're really living it out in real life, and they're going to get real clever with the transitional points. So to me, as a creator, I want to see that transition fully happen and learn how to do that the best possible way for the consumer, figure out our playbook on that, and continue to evolve it. Because right now it's a little too, you can see the cutscene. Even if you're doing it real time, you can still see when the game stops. Oh, I need to listen now. Okay, back into the game. I think that there's an element where I get excited about seeing that be more seamless.
I think that's perfect to kind of transition then into actually speaking about what you went on to do next, which is kind of delving into the world of virtual reality and the Blue. Actually, I got the chance to play that. There was some, I don't forget what it was called, like some science festival, because I did a internship year at Intel Corporation, the chip maker, in my third year of uni. And in the February, just before the pandemic happened, there was like the science festival or whatever, and kind of, we're trying to show off some stuff. Intel had their booth going on, and one of the games that was played on the VR headsets was the Blue. I think it was a very, I don't know, very basic version. There, kids there and stuff, so like they wouldn't want to get too scared or whatever it was. But the whale came by and he looked you in the eye and this type of stuff. And it was pretty cool. It was quite the experience. At the same time, I feel like VR has been this thing that's been talked about for years. It's been when Facebook bought like Oculus or whatever, and they're looking right down the future. And of course, Facebook have made some more changes since then that we might discuss. But it feels to me that the adoption of VR has, I don't know if you'd say it's been slower than expected, but it hasn't. Sometimes things come along and people think they're going to be like a revolutionary change. And sometimes maybe the time wasn't ready, or things take time. The technology takes time to evolve. Obviously, you've been kind of working in that for a few years. Do you think that VR will kind of completely revolutionize the gaming sector, or is it going to be specific to certain genres, or how do you see it going?
That's a big question. There's a lot in there to unpack. First off, I'm happy to hear you had a good experience with the Blue and the whale, and and that moment, right? Because the medium is brand new. There is no real clear playbook like how to make it. And there's experiences, and then there's games, and then there's games/experiences. For me, going into it, coming off of COD, I knew that the thing that I wanted to try to explore and experiment in is the presence space. Like, what does VR give you that sitting on my couch with a controller in my hand, which I love doing, it doesn't give me? And it's that kind of wrapping presence of being in the space and being overwhelmed by the space and being taken in by the space, both audio and visual. And that's really what the blue represents. So working on that for the last 6 years, figuring out how to put people in there together so they can experience it together. That transitioned over into Jon Favreau checking out the blue, and then him coming back and saying, hey, I want to make a brand new product from the ground up. But I want to be the giant. I don't want to be the small thing and big whales and big creatures. I actually want to be the giant, and I want to be interacting with these gnomes and goblins. And so he and I went off, and we literally built from a blank sheet of paper, ground up, a 3 to 4 hour experience around this gnomes and goblins franchise that he wanted to explore. At the core of it, it was experimentation with VR. It's experimentation with presence. It's an experimentation with connectivity, like your eye connection to a virtual character, that character having a basic AI and decision tree and how it reacts to you based on what you do. In many ways, all this stuff is very early and in some ways primitive to where we've gotten in our minds to playing a game on a screen with a controller in our hand. But you have to reset. It's a new medium, and you have to relearn how to make it. And I see competitive gaming going there. Like you see something like Ready Player One. When are we going to get there? I don't know. But I do see that Facebook / now Meta making a major investment in the space is huge for us, because we need that kind of investment to explore it, break it down, make the successes, make the failures, learn from the failures, make new successes, and can build this up. You know, when you look at film started in the early 1900s, right? 1915, 1919, whatever it was. It took many years to see what we consider as great cinema today. Games starting in the 60s and 70s and the 80s and so on. How many years of knowledge is making great games today? We're 6 years, 7 years into this VR exploration. And anybody that says they have it completely figured out, they don't. You know, I've been doing it for 6 years, and I think that we're just in the beginning. But that being said, I do think that it's going to change the space. Is it going to revolutionize the space? I think it's going to be an additive thing, not a taking over, changing thing. I think that it's just going to be another space to, you know, socially connect, which is really important, to have game experiences, have, you know, virtual experiences, going underwater, doing a deep sea dive, doing things that you would just never do in real life, and connect on a human level with people. That is where I see the you know, high level Ready Player One dream playing out, you know, of being able to do that on an omnidirectional pad and with your gun and interacting, having your suit that's, you know, pulsing and hitting when you get hit. I do think a lot of that's being developed, and I've seen quite a bit of R&D in that space, and it's wonderful. Some of which I can't even talk about because I'm you know, NDA'd on a lot of stuff. But it makes me extremely excited about it. It's scary, but I think it's more exciting than scary, right? It's scary because we have to navigate this and be responsible, and that's hard, you know. Being responsible in the space is a tough thing. So, big question you asked me there. Hopefully I answered it in some level, but I'm excited about the space. I do think it's coming. I think it's going to take time. And I think it's going to be a special evolution and additive to the competitive landscape of gaming. And I hope that I'm making product in that space for years to come. That's really why I transitioned there, because I believe it. I think it's why, you know, Facebook and Meta made their investment and their transition. I think when you look at other real-time engines, like what's going on with Unreal and Epic, Unity purchasing, you know, Weta, I think all these things are pointing in really good directions for us to see this what they call the metaverse. I'm not really sure exactly if that's what it will ultimately be, metaverse, Web 3.0, but the evolution of that, you start getting into, cryptocurrency, digital, landscape ecosystems. All of this has to happen for there to be a, virtual space that you can go experience, socialize, play games, share content, buy content, and it's going to take time. Isn't that cool? Like, I think it's pretty cool to think about.
It's cool
VR
to think about.
Yeah, VR is like a Pandora's box. Like I really can't wait to see how that like develops in the future.
Yeah, I do want to dive into that a little bit in more detail. Before we get to that, I did just want to mention briefly, because you mentioned the implications for competitive, right? And that is something I had written down actually about like how, look, if competitive COD goes to VR, all of a sudden all our pros, like, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but you can imagine a world in 10 years where it's possible all the games have gone VR wise, and now, okay, people are playing Call of Duty with their headsets on. Are they using a controller, or are they having the omnidirectional treadmill? And you've got to have proper athletes here, right? They're running around with the, I don't know. It's
It'll be in a
it
lot
would
better
be
shape.
exactly. They would be in a lot better shape. You're absolutely right about that, Jake. But just Lion and Austin, I know you guys have a lot of experience on like the racing side of things. Jake, I know we talked about it just before we went live as well, about like, what's your perspective, Lion, on when you're playing the racing game? Like, you just look at the screen, is that how it goes? Have you used a VR headset for it? Do you think, like, because I imagine that is probably that kind of esport is where this stuff is first gonna kind of properly take over. Maybe it already is to a degree.
Yeah, I think it's really good for sim racing, but I've never tried it. But the reason being is that when you're in a race car, in a real car, you look towards the corner and you can like change your direction to where you are like aiming to go, as opposed to on a monitor, you can just see the one screen and the one perspective. With triple monitors, you can kind of like work around that. But thing I wanted to ask about VR, and especially in like sim racing, how would you tackle the problem with people who have motion sickness to like a VR headset? Because I feel like for a lot of people that might be a problem.
Yeah. My experience with motion sickness, and this is just through the products that I've made, and I'm not speaking so much towards the sim racing side yet, but I'll get there. I'll kind of come around to it. It's all about connecting what you're seeing and what your body is doing, right? And so if your tracking is bad, whether it be sensor based or inside out tracking, if your frame rate's bad, if you have bad network connection or lag, all these things make it feel like something's not synced to what you're seeing and what you're doing. And human movement's very quick. We are fast. Like if I'm looking over there, it's like it happens in a second. And so you have to be ahead of that with the tracking and the sync, right? In VR, that presence, if we will. We call it the presence of feeling. So when you did the blue, for example, one of the things that we made sure to do is that we had the best tracking technology that we could have at that time, and the frame rate was running in both eyes 90 frames a second. Like, it would lock and it would never drop below that. And by doing that, we were able to create a certain level of track point that when you whipped your head left and right, up and down, and you were looking and choosing to look at things, you felt like you were really there. Now, back to your question about sim racing. Well, let's just say you have any one of those things hitting you. Now, all of a sudden, what you're feeling and thinking about doing with that control in your hand doesn't sync up. Let's say you don't even see a virtual hand. Now, all of a sudden, you have a disconnect there. Let's say you don't have a rig that's moving you. Because once you start moving your head around, you're expecting that car to pivot a little bit. That's on a rig that's going to pivot you or adjust you. Your wheel, you need to see some form of an avatar of representation of that. And it needs to be synced up well, because every single thing that your eyes are seeing that doesn't feel like this is going to create motion sickness on some level, even on the subtle, or it's going to create eye fatigue, mental fatigue. So I think some of the first point of entry on that stuff, there's the display, but how do we sync all that stuff up together? The first thing I do, even in a simple rig like you have in the background there, is if you have your controller there, you want to be able to have that and have some form of representation of your hands on the wheels. And I think that will help start grounding you. And then from there, I think you're going to start seeing really advanced rigs. I think you were speaking of it earlier, where it actually pivots a little bit with you in the VR space. And all those things are meant to ground you. Audio, Also, certain level of blinders, like right now, when you have a helmet on, you do cut off certain peripheral vision, so you have to turn your head. These are all little things that we've learned in the VR space that's going to help with that motion sickness. And then I think ultimately the weight of the device is really heavy right now, so it creates fatigue. When that just becomes like a Oakley glasses that you're putting on, like think of like ski glasses, and they're super light and they're wrapping around more naturally, I think that there's something where that'll start to become more and more forgiving. So there's a lot there. I mean, we have to unpack a lot of things, but the promise of it's there. I see all this little advancements in technologies and tests. Each one's getting us a little further, a little further, a little further.
Nice.
So this metaverse thing, right? Like, go on, Austin. Before I dive into the
you're good.
metaverse again.
No,
Well, okay.
the metaverse is
All right.
obviously really interesting. So yeah, dive into that.
Yeah, sure. So this is, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, because I do think about this sometimes, about like the future that Facebook and Meta kind of are perceiving, right? So the idea that it's kind of like the Ready Player One thing, as you're saying, like it's not necessarily just games that we're playing with the headsets on, but I think like probably Zuckerberg and that have visions that you don't actually need to go to the office. You can just put the headset on if the technology is good enough and work with the colleagues in that kind of virtual environment, which is like, it sounds like one of those things which should be the future, right? It's kind of something we haven't explored yet. And as you say, it's these technologies that take a long time to develop, and that might be where things are going. It's not without its concerns from my perspective, because as you say, like there's potential for human contact and interaction through this medium. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on whether, like, obviously we don't know really, but do you think that has any potential effect on like human socialization and how humans interact? Because it seems to me that a lot of these things that we're moving into, we're not necessarily evolved to deal with this kind of environment. And that kind of makes me slightly concerned that it might not be good for our health, right? Because this is something that I think we see a lot nowadays with mobile phones and the internet and all, everything's going so quick that I think it's had a lot of detrimental effects on a lot of people's mental health and stability. Social media and Instagram and all this kind of positive stuff you see out there it's something that humans have never been adapted for, and it's something that we have to learn to manage very quickly. So these are kind of the things that I think about when I think of the metaverse. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think it's justified. I mean, these things changed everything, right?
Yeah.
Smartphones and social media and how do we're not quite still to this day prepared, I think, for some of that instant knowledge at your fingertips, and we're adjusting. Again, big question, philosophical question. For me, I do see that it's going to have impact. I think if you just look at the phone, your first question was, do you think there's going to be impact? Yes. Is it going to be positive or negative? I think that there will be a growing pains through it. I do think that there's a responsibility to the creators making content to help curate that to the best possible good end result. It's difficult to do. But I think in the end, the idea of going to a virtual space and socially connecting and socially playing games or experiences, there's a huge upside to it. And I tend to be a bit more of an optimistic person. I don't tend to get caught up into the dark matter of things. I tend to like to look at the positive side and say, how do we take this emerging technology? And you can go all the way back to computers. You can go back earlier, cars. You can go all the way back. Keep going back in time. There's all these advancements, and how do we take these things and use them for the betterment of humankind, if you will? Social connectivity could be big. And just like this, like we couldn't do this a handful of years ago. Like I see all of you guys, you're all over the globe. Every single person, East Coast, New Zealand, or London, you said? England?
Yeah, not far from London.
Yeah,
I was in London.
We're all over the globe and we're doing this. and the ability and power of social connectivity, and then people listening, and if the questions, that is such a positive force for me that it can be a negative force too. And I think that that's just life, light and dark, right? So this falls under that category. As I said, I think it's a philosophical question. I tend to believe that if you're going to, the best way to start to understand it is to work in it. The best way to start to understand it is contributorverse and try to be good curators of the space. I think John and I talked a lot about that while making Gnomes and Goblins. We wanted to make a product that was very inviting and friendly. Early days VR, the blue, inviting and friendly early days VR. Bring people into the space, let them understand the space, let it be a great entry barrier to the VR space. As we progress, we can take on harder and harder and harder topics. You look at all of the investment on the side with Meta. I see that as a positive influence in the space for learning over the long run, because we need people to do that. Otherwise, it's going to go a different direction. I think I'm excited when gaming starts to invest in the space more. I think Sony's doing that right now. I think some of the bigger developers are going to start doing that, and then that's where we're going to start to see the real impact. But there will be growing pains, in my opinion. It's a tough question you threw at me there.
I thought we'd finish off with a bit of a challenging one, but I agree. Like, on the whole, I'm an optimist as well, and I don't know, something just came to mind there of one of the kind of chronic, I mean, this is again a very different tactic compared to Call of Duty, but one of the problems that happens in our society quite a lot is like the elderly, let's just say the elderly population, a lot of their friends, maybe their spouse passes away and very lonely at times, right? Like you could very much envision a future where, they're interacting via virtual media, which might be very beneficial to a lot of people. It's the kind of thing with social media and the internet. People love to talk about, and for good reason, the negatives of that. But at the same time, the opportunity that has opened up to so many people, I guess including all of us on the call here, and how that's gone has been immense. So it's about managing the downside and the risk and being, I guess, aware of it. That's key, as opposed to not capitalizing on the opportunity, because we have to do that if we want to get anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, early days first-person shooters, right? There was a lot of this early days. Think about like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, Quake, into Call of Duty, Halo, all these different ones. There was a lot of social impact that we talked about while making the game, and we were worried about. And it's there, but I still think that the people making the product and the people playing the product as a whole are curated in a good space. It's not trying to promote violence in a direct sense. It's a game, but there is an aspect of it that you have to acknowledge, while you're making it and while you're playing it. And I think that VR is no different. AR, like that's the other thing we've been talking about. VR, AR is going to come where your glasses are going to be basically projecting things right out in front of you. You're going to be seeing things that other people are not going to be seeing in your own home, whether it be a TV screen, whether it be a virtual puppy, whether it be whatever. That's going to change quite a bit.
Oh, man.
And I find that to be, then once you start connecting the devices, then it's going to become an interesting space inside the home. Or like you're in New Zealand and you're in England and I'm here and we're seeing the same thing in our spaces. It's a kind of a fun place to explore. And in the end, I think you just have to be responsible. So
that's crazy, man. I can customize my virtual dog. I can change it. I'll change make the fur a little bit nicer. Yeah, virtual exactly. Riley. Yeah, I could just download Riley and have him running around. Man, that's quite the future. Austin, Lion, thoughts on that one? Because I think we're going to wrap it up here in just a couple of minutes.
I mean, we're definitely heading towards like a future where all the stuff that we own on the internet is going to be way more valuable than the stuff that we own in real life. People are going to be way more intrigued by their virtual life than in real life. So, as long as people do it responsibly, and I mean, I'm really excited for AR. I think augmented reality is something that's going to be really, really cool. Not to downplay VR, but I just think AR is going to be something that changes our day-to-day lives, I think, in the future. So I'm really excited to see both of those really develop in the next, 10, 15, 20 years.
Agreed. I just can't wait to have like a board meeting like the Avengers, just all of us in
Oh,
the
yeah.
same room digitally. That'd be so cool.
Imagine what Omar could do on the graphics for that. Like
Oh
we all sit
my.
down. We all have our little like I don't know how it would work, but we could have some sort of I guess we'd have to have cameras around the room and they'd project us visually, and then we could all sit around a table and have this discussion, and then we could have like cameras that would capture the meeting from many angles. Um, I mean, I don't know, man. Maybe we'll have to do if we're still going with this podcast in 15 years' time. Maybe
It might not be that. It might not be that long. It
Never
might not
know.
be 15. And so you guys, thanks for having me. Was there questions that you wanted to get to? I know that there was a note here about some Q&A at the end before we wrap.
Well, I mean, that was if people had questions from the chat, but generally a lot of the questions from the chat, I think we covered really as we went along that kind of came through during the show. So yeah, I think pretty much we discussed everything that I wanted to. We had a great discussion.
Yeah, hopefully it was fun
Amazing.
for you guys. It was fun on my side. Thanks for having me, and thanks for kind of letting me relive some memories too. And then on the VR side, what I'd recommend is checking out product. That's where all this started. And go on, get a headset, check it out, see the evolution of it. You can find me on my website, jakerowell.com. I'm usually always working on something. I can't talk about what I'm working on right now, but in 2022, I should have some announcements on my next projects that I'm doing. So, but thanks for having me. It was great.
Fantastic. Can we follow you on
Can't wait.
Twitter? Do you do much on social media, or is it the website is the main?
Website, and then at Jake L. Rowell, I think, is where I'm at with Twitter, and then Instagram, Jake L. Rowell Art. So yeah, those different areas.
Fantastic. Get it followed if you are listening or watching. Thank you very much for your time. We've had a fantastic discussion. Thanks to all those who are watching live after the fact on YouTube, all the stuff. We very much appreciate you. We will be back next week with your kind of regular billing, discussing all the stuff in the competitive Call of Duty world. But it was a fantastic break from regular proceedings to talk about some Call of Duty history and just stuff that you never really get to hear elsewhere. So appreciate that, Jake. Thanks to all those who helped setting this one up. Thanks to Emma behind the scenes. Thanks all for watching, and we will see you next time.